And a lot of diversity is unseen. So we talked at the top about diversity is simply about differences, those that you see and those that you don't see.
The Architects of Business on JOE, in partnership with the EY Entrepreneur of the Year programme, telling the inspirational stories behind Ireland's most successful entrepreneurs.
Hello and welcome to this special edition of the Architects of Business on JOE in partnership with EY Entrepreneur of the Year, where you will hear the inspirational stories of some of Ireland's leading entrepreneurs. I'm your host, Sonya Lennon, and today I will be in conversation with Barrett of Microsoft and Olivia McEvoy from EY about diversity and inclusion in business, in the workplace and in life. Olivia McEvoy and Barrett, you are so welcome to Architects of Business. Olivia, you are Director of Diversity and Inclusion, client-facing in EY. So you sell diversity and inclusion as a product.
Exactly. I mean, I always say I have the great privilege of leading EY's Diversity and Inclusion Advisory Programme. So yeah, we work with clients to achieve their ambitions on diversity and inclusion, work with them on their programmes. That could be over a very, very long period, maybe 6 to 12 months if they're implementing a D&I strategy, or it could be simply for half a day if we're delivering inclusive leadership training. So all days are very different, all clients are very different. I always say diversity and inclusion work is sector agnostic. You could be working in any sector, any size of organisation. And it is an untold privilege to be working with clients who really want to make positive, meaningful change in this area.
And have you seen an explosion in the demand for your services?
I would say explosion is probably a very strong word. I mean, I think I'm in the role...
That's my optimism coming into play now.
It is, and I wish you were right. I absolutely wish you were right. I'll be in the role 3 years in September. Okay. And I would say, you know, at the very beginning, we built the service, but we also had to build the market a little bit and educate that market. And it's a relatively immature market in Ireland. We actually, you know, we apply the results of our study to a maturity model, and over half of the organisations would fall into what we might kindly call the starting blocks. We are in the starting blocks as a nation. But at the same time, there are lots of organisations doing really, really good work and making that progressive change. But I think there's everything from people at the very start, people knowing they even need to start and haven't done that yet, kind of people doing really excellent work and probably, you know, making that progressive change, and everything in the middle.
Christine, your role in Microsoft is in sales, but you also head up diversity and inclusion.
So, as you said, I head up inside sales for the UK. I'm based here in Dublin, and my passion is diversity and inclusion. So I am the exec sponsor for diversity and inclusion in inside sales. Inside sales was started just over 2.5 years ago, and we went from 0 to 750 people. So clearly diversity and inclusion is very important as part of that. We have 45 or 35 languages. We've got numerous nationalities. In fact, in Microsoft, we've over 72 nationalities. So you can imagine cultural diversity is absolutely huge in everything we do, from gender to culture. So people coming from every different nationality, as I've said, to accessibility, to LGBT, and everything in between. So we cover everything.
So let's just do, for your granny, diversity and inclusion. So you are on your beautiful campus with 72 or 73 languages. What are we being diverse about?
So we're being diverse about, first of all, probably gender. So making sure that we have, you know, we wouldn't have 50-50 in terms of females, but we're really striving to get as close to 50% of our females in all of the roles. In fact, in my own team, so I sell, as I said, into the UK. So I have account executives that are selling over the phone to our customers. And I purposely wanted to get 50-50. And I'm delighted to say that we have 50% females and 50% male. That's not the norm. We still have a ways to go. So that's gender. Obviously, the big thing for us is our mission in the company is to empower every individual and organisation on the planet to achieve more. That's a huge, lofty goal, but we live it day in, day out. And we're all about reflecting every individual and organisation on the planet. So that means cultural diversity, gender, age, LGBT, everything we want to reflect. So if you're trying to empower everybody, you need to look like everybody.
And how difficult is that as somebody who hires? How difficult is that to keep front of mind all the time?
So you have to be deliberate about it. It's very easy to slip into, okay, this is the right person and they'll, we can bring them in. But if you want to have gender diversity, I purposely had to say, right, to 2 of my managers, we need to stop now. We have enough males. We need to go after females. Let's go out into the market. And it may not always be easy, particularly if you think about in the engineering and in the STEM areas. It's very difficult to find many, many females. So you have to be deliberate. So you have to search and go out there. And it's all about, you're always hiring. So it's not just because you have a job, but you're always looking for people. So, when I was in college, we always talked about ABC, always be closing. We talk about ABH, always be hiring.
Fantastic.
Can I add a bit there about the granny question?
That's why you're here.
Yes. I love that question about, describe this for your granny or describe it for a child, because it is really so important. And I think the diversity piece, it is simply about differences. Diversity is just about differences. And Christine mentioned them all, whether that's age, race and ethnicity, gender, but it's also about what we call cognitive diversity or thought diversity. So different thinking styles, personality types, perspectives. And ultimately, you're looking for people to come from all of those different strands so that you get that thought diversity into your business, into your organisation, so that you come up with better ideas, better products, better services, because you have all of these people coming from the different perspectives. But why does diversity and inclusion always come together? And I think the inclusion part sometimes gets forgotten. And that inclusion is about, people feeling valued, that they are valued, but they also feel valued, so they can actually achieve and contribute their full potential to that organisation. And obviously, if you get people feeling that, then again, you've got better engagement, better products, better services.
So let's go back to this non-explosion
Yes.
in the national landscape.
Yeah.
Can we have a little chat about where the country is?
Yeah.
So Ireland, fantastic little country, agile, able to latch onto an idea and run with it if the will is there.
Yeah.
So what is happening in the wider landscape in Ireland in diversity and inclusion?
Well, hot off the press, so we do conduct a report of diversity and inclusion survey report across the island of Ireland annually. So this is the 3rd report out. It's 2019. We've just launched it this month, and it's called Everybody In, and it's that exact idea, which is that if diversity and inclusion is to be our competitive advantage as a nation, then we need everybody in. So it's not enough for just Microsoft and EY and all of the bigger organisations. Actually, we need all organisations to be contributing their bit if we are to have this success as a nation. So what is that state of the nation? And I'll kind of throw out a few of the themes but the kind of general narrative for the last 3 years has been, and we have 150 organisations completing this survey across all sectors, all sizes of organisations, but there's a disconnection between what organisations say about diversity and inclusion and what they're actually doing about it. So I do joke and say diversity and inclusion is a little bit like Christmas. It's very hard to be against it. Why would you be against diversity and inclusion? But when it comes to actually investment and what you're prepared to do, that's a slightly different story. So in a hopeful way, 100% of organisations now say that diversity and inclusion is vital to business performance. Now, that's a really big statement, I think, vital to business performance. But yet, only 16% of those organisations are actually measuring the impact. About a half have got a strategy, and 31% spend 0p on diversity and inclusion. So
which is an indicator of where the issue sits on a business priority list.
Yeah, and in a sea of competing priorities, it is very difficult for diversity and inclusion to compete, but it has to compete. So people therefore do need to understand that business case. Why would I invest my time? Why would I invest those resources in diversity and inclusion? But that leadership role is really important in that as well, and that comes out very clearly in the study. There is a disconnection as well, and kind of a lack of leadership accountability. So again, while a lot of leaders are driving it, it's not in their scorecards. It's not on their performance measurement. And what we do find is that if you have it on scorecards, if this is part of people's compensation and reward, if it is part of their goals and objectives, just like sales and revenue targets and all of those other good things with business, well, guess what? What gets measured gets done, and suddenly it is a priority for everybody, and it has to be a priority for everybody. It's going to be driven through the business. And so, Christine, leadership really, I always say it's big L, little l, right? So there's leadership from the top, but it's personal leadership within the organisation as well. And you
you must see that in Microsoft. If you truly are living this policy within the organisation, how does that play out on a day-to-day basis?
So I would say, I would go back a little bit just on Microsoft. So on the 4th of February 2014, we had a change of leader in Microsoft. So Satya Nadella came in, and with that, the change in the organisation started, and it was cultural transformation. So we went into what we call growth mindset, so that we're always learning, we're always listening. We're not the big dog, we're not the big 800-pound gorilla that we would have been deemed to be in the past. So we have to show.
Can I just ask you, I'm going to cut across you there, how long did that change take to manifest?
I would say it's still going on. So it's not something that is done. We're still in the process.
When did you start to see the effects of that
within
the organisation?
Right from the get-go.
Okay.
Right from the get-go, with that change, this humility, showing that, from the top, and it was coming all the way down. And when Olivia said earlier that there isn't a scorecard, in Microsoft, leaders do have a scorecard.
Yeah.
So each, and in fact, every individual has a commitment, or we call it a core priority, around diversity and inclusion. And we all have to personalise it. So when we talk about inclusion and you talk about leadership, yes, it starts at the top and it trickles down through the organisation. But inclusion it's everybody, everyone owns it. So it's, how do I show up? How does every individual show up to be more inclusive?
And I think that's really interesting that it was pretty much instantaneous, because, I feel diversity and inclusion as a tagline is almost wrong. This is about the culture of an organisation. And to hear that a culture can change almost overnight with a new leader means that leaders do have the power to make a positive impact.
I mean, I think there's a short game and there's a longer game, you need to get those quick wins in quickly so that there's a momentum in organisations, and that's really important, that people see that change quite quickly. But at the same time, the programme that we run, it's called a transformation programme, a D&I transformation programme, and we are working with lots of clients. I shouldn't say that there has been a complete lack of explosion. There are lots of clients who have wanted to kind of have this transformational change, and it's designed to make changes in systems, in structures, in processes. So in your recruitment, in your hiring, in your brand, in the data that you're collecting, so that if Sonya or Christine walks out the door, it doesn't walk out with them as that champion. And the changes that you're making in those recruitment and whatever those processes might be, that is a longer game, because that does take time. So I think there's kind of short-term gains to be had, and people need to see that momentum. But at the same time, if you want cultural change, you need to accept that those system and structural changes will take a while, but you also have to start, and it's where you have to make the change if you want it to be cultural and if you want it to be impactful over a long period.
I know that Better Balance, Better Business are about to publish targets for female leadership in organisations in Ireland. And there is always a big argument about quotas. And I suppose coming down the line, there's a lot of talk about gender equality at the moment. That's sort of the icebreaker. There's so much more to come in its wake, and I think the only reason for that is gender is 50% of the population are women, and that's a big driver. Can you see a world where, Christine, I'll ask you, where we have targets or quotas for all these numbers across D&I and organisations?
So I would say in the past I was against quota, but Olivia said it earlier, if you don't measure, it's not going to change. So I think we have to measure, and I think it is the right thing to do. I hear people that are against it, and I understand their reasoning, but it's taking a long, long time to get to where we are currently. And we really have to measure. And I think having a measure of 50-50, you say, to reflect, 50-50 in terms of our gender balance, we have to push and strive towards that.
And do you think a target can be as effective as a quota within an organisation?
I think so.
Okay.
It's like everything. It's like sales. You measure your target. This is what you're working towards. So if you don't have a target, you're not going to get there. So I feel having a target is absolutely essential to get there.
We set goals and objectives for every other area of business. So for sales, for revenue, if you're in the public service, there are still goals and objectives that you have to meet. So why are we not doing it for diversity and inclusion? And we have to, and that's that part of it sliding off the side of the desk, in that can't compete in the sea of competing priorities. If there's no target, if it's not part of people's roles, if it's not embedded into their psyche, then it's not going to happen. And it's interesting in the report, and because we know that gender pay gap legislation is coming down, we've asked the question over the last 2 years, do you favour legislation or regulation as a driver of having more diverse in organisations? 59% of organisations now favour regulation or legislation to have more diverse in organisations. For me, that's really high. And I think it's because we know that we need the carrots and the sticks in order to make it happen. And because we know the gender pay gap legislation is coming, 35% of organisations have already taken appropriate measures to address the gender pay gap. Now, the legislation is not even here yet, and 35% have already started those measures. And that's the effect of having regulation or legislation or targets or measures or quotas, whatever it is that you want to call them. And there is a difference between targets and quotas. Quotas are mandated, whereas targets is something that you set as an objective, as you do for your sales target. You mightn't meet it, but at the same time, if you don't set it, you're never going to get there.
It does posit a sense of accountability, though.
Absolutely.
Even internally. So carrot and stick, again, they're two words that I really don't like in this arena, because I think that you should want to do it, right? Again, it's a bit like the Christmas argument. If you're against it, you're certainly not going to tell anybody,
Yeah.
So who is doing it right? Who has created a culture where this has been normalised, in your opinion?
I mean, there are lots of organisations who are doing it really well. I mean, obviously, I probably have a job because a lot of organisations were coming to EY saying, you do this really well. How do you go about that? And they were coming to for advice. And so we set up the advisory business and started to advise companies. I would say that the financial services sector are beginning to really move. Again, because the central bank has been really driving that. There's been a lot of regulatory change in the UK, and because we have a lot of parent companies, the financial services companies have a lot of parent companies in the UK, that has driven it here as well. So I think one of the biggest sea changes has been in the financial services sector, again, because there has been that kind of regulation and central bank really driving that agenda on gender diversity, but also on thought diversity. So that's not to name any one company. I mean, we're working with Permanent TSB, one of the really big banks, who have gone through that full transformation program that I talked about. So they did a diagnostic, which is to find out where are we at, what's working well, what are the gaps, what is the employee experience of inclusion. That gives you that evidence base then to build a strategy, a D&I strategy that's bespoke to your organisation. Because we could all probably pluck a D&I strategy out of the sky or off the internet, but the strategy has to be realistic for your organisation. It has to be actionable with an action plan. So it can't have a little strategy. It has to have really clear KPIs, action plan, who's responsible for driving what element, etc. And it also has to be collecting the data. And that's kind of that third element. You have to gather that data. You have to know, well, what is the diversity profile of our organisation? And you have to cut that by your hiring, your recruitment. Who are we promoting? How fast are we promoting those people? Are women getting promoted faster than men? It doesn't happen very often. But if you don't have the data, you can't track that. But when you do have the data, you can track that. And then the fourth element of that is leadership. So we deliver a lot of inclusive leadership training, but you've got to have that leadership on board, both at the executive levels, but also all through the organisation. In one way, you could argue it's nearly too late starting with the executive levels. They're a way down the road in their careers. Actually, we have to start way back with those middle managers who are beginning to manage people teams, and they have to have those skills. And it is a skill to be an inclusive leader and to have some of those skills to drive that.
Just before I move back to you, Christine, I have to ask, because I'm kind of fascinated, how do you develop a hiring policy for inclusivity of thought, and how do you even begin to do that?
Yeah, and it's a really good question. How do we even measure that diversity of thought? And I would say we're in kind of the early stages of how we do that. Yes, there are lots of personality tests, so you want to make sure that you have people coming from those kind of different perspectives. But ultimately, it's about I think if you put on that diversity lens on your recruitment program and make sure you've got people coming from different backgrounds, different educational backgrounds. Maybe they're not all coming from universities. Maybe some of them are coming through apprenticeships. People are coming from different social backgrounds, different race, different ethnicity, people who have travelled, that different perspective idea. And if you get people coming from those different strands of diversity, then you are likely to have that thought diversity. But in hiring, we typically hire ourselves. We very much tend to hire, oh, there's a little mini me. You know that you do a good job. You could do it another of you in the business. And you think you typically hire yourself. So you need to put on that kind of unconscious bias piece in your hiring program and make sure we're not just hiring each other and that we're hiring people who are very, very different, that look very different and that act very different, speak very different and think very differently to us.
No problem.
Yeah, I know. It's a really easy win. Yeah.
So, Christine, unconscious bias is a huge part of this, and I did ask the question, who does it right? Olivia gave very little away in terms of names, apart from EY, but Microsoft do a very, very good job on this. So, talk to us a little bit about some of the programs that are rolled out.
So we have a diversity and inclusion, obviously, strategy. I talked earlier about everybody in the organisation, from the top right down through the organisation, has a diversity and inclusion, what we call a core priority, that you have to personalise. Olivia talked earlier about diversity. Diversity is easy. You can hire all the the diverse people. It's really the inclusion. How do you make people feel that they belong? And belonging is a big piece of inclusion. People's voices are heard. Some people are introverts, some people are extroverts. Making sure, even in meetings, are you hearing everybody's perspective? Also, in times of stress, are you looking out for each other? This is the month of mental health awareness, so we're having different conversations with people across the organisation around it's okay not to be okay, and managers looking out for the signs and also looking out that managers are okay.
Go back to this personal imperative piece. Talk to me in a little bit more detail about that.
So it's everybody was given this task to. Diversity and inclusion is a core tenet of our existence in Microsoft. Again, I talked about you have to reflect your customers. So the diversity within your customer base, you have to reflect that. So everybody is tasked with, how am I going to be more inclusive? How do I help with making sure that this is an inclusive culture? So if I take my diversity and inclusion, how I personalised it, so I've got 50-50 gender diversity on my team. One of the things that I'm committing to is to continue to have 50-50. So if somebody leaves, making sure that we continue and maintain that balance. The other thing is having skip level engagement with people that don't report directly to me, but report to my managers.
What is skip level engagement?
So for example, if Olivia reports to me and you report to Olivia, I will have a meeting with you on a regular basis. And things that I would touch base on with you is, how are you feeling? How are you getting on with Olivia? Are you feeling included? Do you think that the organisation is an inclusive organisation? So little, conversations like that. And then the other thing that I do is I mention inclusion in every team meeting that we have, and that's something that I've personalised. And it's all about, things like, are we listening to everybody? How are people doing in times of stress? Are we open to everybody's perspective? So there are some.
So does everybody in Microsoft have a little set of principles by which they live?
Yes.
And they're personalised, they've developed them themselves.
Yeah.
I mean, it's funny, isn't it? Like, all of this discussion really boils down to human kindness and empathy and
Simple things.
Yeah. Simple things.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Embracing the difference that everybody has. Just rather than sometimes we would make assumptions, let's embrace it as opposed to making and jumping to conclusions. Do we still jump to conclusions? Of course we do. People are human. But catching yourself as well, so that you are always thinking about, how do I make this culture inclusive.
And I think you can't really put the genie back in the bottle then. Once you're aware of this as a way of living, you can't unsee it.
Absolutely. But it is, I think, and it is really important as well for smaller organisations to realise that it is those smaller things that absolutely make a difference. And I think the art of, getting to know people personally, it's nearly a lost art form. And particularly as organisations grow very quickly, that can just get lost. But actually that's still really important. And it's still really important to younger people coming into the organisation. And similar to Christine, we have something called Coffee Connects, which is, for our people advisory service, which I'm part of, it's about 60 people in the organisation, throw everybody into the hat hat and you simply draw out 2 names. And so Sonya and Olivia, who don't know each other, and you could be the leader of the organisation and I could be an intern coming in, you go for a 30-minute coffee in the month. And it's just a really brilliant way of kind of breaking down those barriers and that getting to know people personally. And I think smaller organisations have that advantage of being able to kind of have that kind of agility in their very youthful part of their business, and to maintain that as teams grow and as the business grows is really important.
I mean, we have interviewed some amazing, very successful entrepreneurs who've been through the EY Entrepreneur of the Year programme on this show. And what's interesting is that they have very naturally embedded these positive behaviours within their organisation from day one. And they don't even see it as a big deal. It's certainly not a D&I strategy. It's just, you know, creating a good place to work. And I think they almost take that for granted because they're good people with good values and they want their people to be happy. But there is definitely a truth in that if you're beginning an organisation, you need to begin as you want to be at the very end, you know, and that's where you really do need to be mindful of the culture you create, because this is a cultural issue, no doubt.
And that leadership behaviour piece is an absolute cornerstone of that. And so if you start that as you mean to go on, and you can continue that, you know, and it comes out in the report that, you know, a lot of organisations aren't even calling out non-inclusive behaviour or language, and it's absolutely essential that leadership calls that out. Now, it doesn't have to be in a really dramatic or confrontational way, but that you take people aside and go, you know, I notice that you used inappropriate behaviour, language, whatever it might have been, and you call that out and go, that's actually not okay. Move on, no drama, but that if leadership are calling that out, that cuts that out of a culture straight away.
After the break, we're going to dive a little bit more into neurodiversity, which is the next phase, and the business case for D&I.
The Architects of Business on JOE, in partnership with the EY Entrepreneur of the Year programme.
Welcome back, Olivia and Christine. We have spoken a lot about gender, but it's not just about gender. This is a very broad spectrum of diversity that we need to think about. And I was recently at a pre-production meeting for an event, and we have a relay of 15 micro stories from the stage. And I slightly nervously asked the question around what is our disability representation, what is our gender representation, not really knowing if that was the right thing to even ask, if that made it seem tokenistic, which wasn't the case. How do people develop a language to discuss diversity?
And it's really important, actually, that we don't become so PC that we're afraid to ask those questions, because actually we need to celebrate the diversity that we have in the room. But to celebrate the diversity, you do have to know the diversity that you have in the room or that you have in the business or wherever it is. And a lot of diversity is unseen. So we talked at the top about diversity is simply about differences, those that you see and those that you don't see. So a lot of disabilities are not seen. Various ethnicities are not seen. So there's lots of elements of diversity that people either choose not to disclose, and that's absolutely fine too, and it's important that people don't have to disclose, but at the same time we have to still have that curiosity and ask those questions, and not to be afraid to ask those questions.
So how do we support people to have that language?
I think it is important that people realise that it is a skill and that it is a particular language, but also not to be afraid to ask questions, and to ask those questions of those persons if they are transgender, if they have disability, if they are from a different race and ethnicity, to ask questions going, tell me about your background, do you mind if I ask what is the right language to use, what are the correct pronouns to use? We don't have to know by osmosis. We will only know if we ask the questions. And I think if you ask them in a respectful way, then people will kind of give you that respectful answer, and you will then learn by doing.
And so neurodiversity, which is an unseen diversity, I think that is something that is almost a new piece of the puzzle.
Yeah.
Talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, it is very much in that next practice insight space. And I wouldn't people to think, or organisations to think, oh, here's another thing now that we have to be doing. We weren't thinking about neurodiversity. But we have lots of neurodiverse persons, or people who are not neurotypical.
What is neurodiverse?
Exactly. So it tends to be people who are, maybe they might be on the autism spectrum, Asperger's, have ADHD, dyspraxia, those types of conditions. And they tend to think differently. And if you think about what are we aspiring to get into organisations through the gender diversity, through cultural diversity, it is that thought diversity. And here is a cohort of people who think differently, and yet 85% of neurodiverse people are unemployed. So it is a completely untapped market. And they have, neurodiverse persons tend to think in quite a particular way and have great attention and focus on detail. So you'll find maybe neurodiverse persons working in data analytics, in forensics, in fraud, and as Christine will tell you, they are hard people to come by. So it is that untapped market, and there's lots of brilliant examples. We had an example in the US where we had a 29-day manual process in an audit process, and through thinking about it differently, neurodiverse persons that we employed, and we employ neurodiverse persons now, 45 in a programme going to 90 this year, through centres of excellence and innovation, they brought that down to a 2-day process.
Wow.
Simply by thinking about it differently.
Christine, you're nodding your head furiously there. You obviously have experience of this.
Absolutely. We as you know, have an autism programme that we've recently launched in Ireland, but it has been in existence in the US for some time. And it's really tapping into this potential that exists, particularly those who are autistic, because the attention to detail that these individuals have is phenomenal. So, for example, we've hired some data scientists, we've hired some software engineers, content writers, again, to open up the world to, or open us up to these people to come and work with us
in a very specific way.
In a very specific way, and it's again back to embracing the difference and embracing these differences, and the attention to detail that these people bring is something that other people don't have. So having that and having them in the workforce is absolutely essential.
And to be clear, they're working as part of blended teams.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Now, we do invest heavily in how we hire them, because the hiring has to be very different. It isn't about, if you think about bringing them into an interview similar to any interviews, no, we have a very different programme. In fact, we do it over a couple of days, get them used to the organisation. So we do it very differently, and we train our managers on inclusive hiring. How do they go about that?
So go back a step. At the sourcing process then, to bring these people into a pipeline for interview, what does that look like?
So we would have people that would go out, we launched the programme out, very broadly, and we got hundreds of CVs. And then we would have people within the organisation that would go through those CVs and review them and have been trained in what they should look for, and then reach out to individuals and we bring them in for interview. As I said, the interview is very different to other interviews. And then we also have to train our managers. How do you deal with people on the autistic spectrum? How do you make them feel included? How do the rest of the team make them feel included? So there's a lot that you have to invest in order to make it successful. We're early days and we're learning as we go, and we've taken a lot of knowledge from what they did in the US and brought it here to make it successful.
Fantastic.
Because in some instances it is smaller accommodations that make all the difference. It might be noise cancelling earphones, it might be having a set desk and that familiarity rather than having, let's say, come in and find your own desk type thing. But I think that interview process, it's really important to ram that home. For us, it's a 2-week assessment. So persons come in and they do a 2-week assessment and they go through a whole big process. And again, it's to find out, can you manage at work, and, can you be integrated into, whatever the teams are, even if they have those inclusive behaviours. But that interview process is really, really important. But, talking of human stories, at the end of it, we have people who have been told by their own parents that they live in a world where they just won't have a job. And if they do have a job, it will be a very menial role. And these are people of the highest intelligence. And at the end of that 2-week process, when you are giving people the news that they are going to get a job in EY, they are going to get a job in data analytics, in fraud, in forensics, whatever it might be, but it is a very meaningful job, there are a lot of tears.
That's extraordinary.
On both sides of the house.
I bet.
And we have actually an example in the US where a mother wrote and thanked the company, and how she had seen the difference in her son, and now that her son felt valued. So if you think about diversity and inclusion, and particularly inclusion, it's feeling valued, feeling you belong to something. And she wrote to just say thank you, that now her son is a different person because he's valued, he belongs to something, and he's in a job, and he feels included.
So there's a place for everybody. They just
Absolutely.
have to find it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And sometimes we have to create it, and we have
it.
to create it differently. And the same environment doesn't suit everybody.
Talk to us a little bit about In Motion. So this is a series of events that you are running. You've done one in Dublin recently.
Yes.
I think there's events coming up in Dublin, in Cork and
In
Belfast.
Cork and Belfast is to come. Yeah.
So what do you cover in those events?
So again, this is the third year, and we launched the report at that as well. So they come hand in hand, and they are about, I guess, providing a little bit of thought leadership, but really inspiring and encouraging organisations to go further on that D&I journey through inspiration by human connection and networking. So each year we cover, different strands of diversity, as we called them earlier. This year the focus was very much on inclusion, driving that focus on inclusion through gender diversity, which we touched on, through the cultural diversity, which Christine spoke about, and we looked at that from both an employee and an employer perspective, which I think is really important to do. And
Absolutely,
and to see it
because
through those
one side of the
lenses.
story is no good, right?
And could be very different, and we need to learn from kind of both sides, as in, this is what we need as an employer, but actually this is what we need as employees. And there was some great kind of practical tips that coming out of that. We also looked at
What were the key ones?
Well, this was the lady who delivered them. So she knows.
One which is just weather. So the two people we had, one was from Egypt and the other person had come from Pakistan. So obviously the weather is something that they have to adapt to. We can't change that. The big thing was just around housing and how, so we know we have a lot to do. We do have, accommodation people that will help people when they come over. Because people move over here and some people bring their families. So what are the best schools? Where should they go? There's some of the things we do. We also have culture days. So last week we had a culture day for Middle East and Africa. So understanding people from the Middle East and Africa, understanding what Ramadan is, being more inclusive of, this Ramadan started, I think, just today. We sent out a note, or it started yesterday, saying everybody just be aware of your colleagues who are going through Ramadan, that they can't eat, they can't drink during the day. So they may be a little bit tired, they may be a little bit...
cranky.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So, give them the space. Equally, you may know that they're going to prayer a lot more often. So we have a facility where we have a prayer room where they can go. And all of that. So there's just some of the things that we do. Also, it is when people move, having a buddy. So having a buddy system to help you. Where do I go in Dublin? Where should you not go? Where are the schools, as I talked to? And also just having some social events so that they feel, okay, I can go out, I can meet new people, and we do that on a regular basis.
And in my experience, the buddy probably gets as much out of the experience as the candidate.
Absolutely, because, you learn. In fact, one thing that we do have as well in Microsoft, which is slightly different to cultural diversity, but it is generational diversity, so the millennials and, dinosaurs like myself. So we have reverse mentoring. And I have somebody who has mentored me in the past who's a millennial, and it's just so enriching. You learn so much from each other. And it is that, it's not a unilateral, it's a bilateral relationship, and it really, really is enriching.
Fantastic.
Christine had a gorgeous phrase on stage, which was, come as you are and then do what you love.
Beautiful.
And that's a great one
Everybody
around the
should
inclusion.
aspire to that.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
that was a really good one.
And it is about, no matter who you are, where you're from, what your sexual orientation is, just come as you are and do what you love. And we're all about, if you're making a culture inclusive, people can do their best work.
So I suppose that is all the really beautiful, human, warm and fuzzy stuff. It's so much more than that. I'm being facetious, of course. Talk to us now about the business case, because this isn't just the right thing to do. It's a good thing for business to do.
Yeah, and people are motivated by different elements of that. Some people are really passionate about diversity and inclusion, and they're motivated because this is the right thing to do. This is from an equal rights, from a societal rights perspective, and that is true. And I think we need to not kind of put that under the carpet, as in this is still the right thing to do, but it is also the business smart thing to do. And I think that's fairly well accepted. And for different organisations in different sectors, it's probably different hooks. For all organisations, I think the one that brings us together is that piece around talent acquisition and talent retention. So we know that certainly in Ireland and even globally, there's a big war on talent out there. It is hard to get really good people. And if you have a diverse organisation, you are blowing open the pool of talent that is available to you. But diversity attracts diversity. So if you get diversity into your organisation, you're going to be much more likely to attract wider diversity into the organisation. And the retention part, the inclusion part, is really part for that retention. So as all hirers would tell you, it is expensive to hire people into the organisation. So when you have gone to that expense of hiring people into the organisation, the inclusion part is really important to retain those people that you have in the first instance. So I think that talent acquisition and retention is probably one of the big drivers for the business case. But for other organisations, particularly if you have a big consumer market, and Christine talked about this, it's a reflecting the diversity of your consumer market. So to be your customer, to know your customer, you have to be your customer. So therefore you need your customers in your organisation. You need people who are from different markets, different emerging markets, different races, different ethnicities, different genders, etc. And then probably in the financial services sector in particular, I think the risk excellence, what we call risk excellence, is really important. So you want an environment where people feel that they can put up their hand and say, I think there's something wrong here. And the central bank would probably argue that that didn't happen in 2008 in the financial crisis. Well, probably better still now, we want people putting up the same hand and say, I think there's a better way of doing this. And that's connected to your innovation. And that's that really big driver for it, for that idea of having better services, better ideas, better products. And it's back to why do we want that thought diversity in the business. And then it's also obviously about team collaboration and leadership and all of those pieces. But there are some people who are like, yeah, fine, but that's just a bit amorphous for me, and they want to know what's the bottom line. All sorts of studies out there. The McKinsey study is probably the most cited study, which is companies in the top quartile for racial and ethnic diversity are 35% more likely to have higher financial returns, and companies in the top quartile for gender diversity are 15% more likely to have higher returns. So it is about bottom line as well as all of those pieces, the talent and acquisition, which also costs you money.
So have you seen in terms of performance in Microsoft globally, I suppose, what sort of impacts has this had?
So I can take my own team as an example where I talk about a 50-50 in terms of 50 female, 50% male for our account executives. And we're selling into the UK and it's all over the phone. So we're selling cloud over the phone to our customers. And what I'm seeing is double-digit growth. So we've done 7 quarters now and double digits. I can't go into all of the details, but
Absolutely.
For double-digit growth, which is phenomenal, particularly.
And so layered on top of the gender diversity is also the neurodiversity, ethnic diversity, LGBT, all the other stuff.
And the background. I mean, I've got somebody on the team who a couple of years ago was selling suits and is now selling cloud. So we talk about hire.
I guess if you can sell a suit, you can sell cloud.
Yeah, and you know that.
I totally do.
But it's also about you hire for people's, ambition, for, how they, just about how they are and how they interact, and the skills will follow. So we've got that background, so gender or background diversity that you talked about earlier. And you also hear, I hear the people on the phone and how they engage with customers, and they're very receptive to Irish accents as well, which is really, it's great to hear that, from the UK. They love engaging with our Irish account executives. I would also say...
There's some great new Irish accents out there as well.
Yes, there are.
Adopting the Irish accent,
yeah, exactly.
no matter where you come
Exactly.
from. Yeah.
But I would say as well, problem solving and innovation, where you have different perspectives. You talked about that process that you had, which was X number of days, and now you brought it down to 2 days. What we see is with all of the gender diversity or the diversity that we have in the organisation, problem solving is so much more effective because people have different perspectives. Then when it comes to innovation, coming up with new ideas, again with the different perspectives, and if you listen and tap into that diversity, you can come up with some really, really creative ideas. And in fact, our CEO, when he started out back in 2014, one of the first things he did was we had a hackathon. And basically it was looking at what are the problems that we want to solve for. And one of the teams that won was for somebody who suffers that they have no mobility, and it was how can we help them use our software using their eyes. And that won our hackathon, and our CEO then invested time and energy into making that real for that person, and indeed for people who do have that disability.
That's fantastic. We have an audience that are peppered with future entrepreneurs, business founders, people at the beginning of their journey as business people. What tips would you give those people in terms of how to build the right culture from the beginning?
I would say the first thing for me is being deliberate about it. It doesn't happen overnight. You've got to be deliberate. And thinking about, no matter what size your organisation is, think about your customer base and what you want to reflect to your customer base. And equally for people within the organisation, there's a saying that says, I can't be what I can't see. So if you have all the same type of people in the organisation and you're trying to hire and retain people, they're looking at your organisation and saying, I can't be what I want to be in that organisation, so why would I work there? So it's small things, and it's even, when you're hiring, if you're looking to hire a female, don't have an all-male panel in the interview loop. Again, if you want to hire somebody who's a millennial, don't have all people of a certain vintage interviewing them. So it's small things. It's not huge things. It's just those small things. And once you start to think about it and you start that process, it'll become natural and it filters down through the organisation.
Fantastic. Olivia, some free EY advice for all our entrepreneurs listening.
I think the most important thing to do is start. And I think when you're starting a business, it's really easy for diversity and inclusion to slide off the table and think, oh, well, why would I be thinking that when I have to get, all of these other elements of business set up? But actually, if you started and if you embed it from the get-go, it'll just simply become part of those systems, structures, how you do business. And if D&I is to be a success, it has to be part of how you do business. It has to be embedded into the culture of the organisation. So start with it, I think. But I would also say to adopt a kind of holistic and strategic approach. So people might kind of think, I'll do gender now, and then I'll move on to LGBT, and then I'll move on to abilities or disabilities. And actually it needs to be more holistic than that. And people come with intersectionalities. People don't just come as a woman or as an LGBT person. They are all of the above and lots of different things. So to think about it in a very, very holistic way, but to think about it strategically. And by that I mean to have a strategy or have a plan and have an implementation plan and have persons who are responsible for making that plan happen, just like every other element of business.
Ladies, it has been fantastic talking to you. The
Pleasure.
future is bright. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sonya.
Thank you, Sonya.
Thanks for listening to Joe's Architects of Business in partnership with EY Entrepreneur of the Year. Thanks to everybody here at Maximum Studios and, of course, as ever, to my guests, Olivia and Christine. If you haven't already done so, please subscribe to the show to get a brand new episode into your feed for free every fortnight. I'm Sonya Lennon. Talk soon.